Great, let's get started. I am Stefania. You can call me Steph. I'm the CEO and co-founder of a company called Avo. We fix data quality and product analytics. What that means in practice, we help companies like Adobe, Fender, Walt, CultureAmp, IKEA, Boost, but also startups and scale-ups to make sure they have proper analytics and are not flying blind when they are trying to build great user experiences. And specifically, we exist to inspire better data cultures so teams can build great user experiences. Today, I am going to go a little bit through sort of my learnings that led us up to starting that company. Why would we start that company? And how I have managed to apply some of those learnings to recommend how people get started on building better data cultures. And I'm gonna just dive right into that. So we'll go through this in sort of a few sections. What led us to Avo, covering then a little bit what is the first mile of data. And I'm specifically thinking about product analytics, as I talked about, and then where should people start. I started my data career in genetics. I was a genetics researcher, and I was designing developer interfaces, or bash script interfaces. That was my role at Decode Genetics 13 years ago or so, or 12 years ago. And that's where I learned how to develop or program. I'm a mathematician and a philosopher. Hadn't touched anything like that before, other than like basic R and MATLAB stuff in my studies. And all of a sudden I was designing bash script interfaces, and it was a lot of fun. I loved it. There's like a lot of product design element to that and sort of user experience element to that. How do you create something that a doctor that has no insights in sort of developing can interact with a bash script in their terminal, extracting data from genetics. It was a lot of fun. So I was working with huge data sets, doing sort of distributed computing, probably what we would call data engineering today, but we didn't call it then. Then I went into product analytics, and that was before it was called product analytics. I joined as the founding analyst of a mobile game called QuizUp. That was a great game that a lot of people played. We had 100 million users around the world. I joined as the first analyst, like I said, when QuizUp had just launched and reached 1 million users in our first 5 days. And I don't know how many of you have struggled with like getting 30 people to use your product. And then when you launch something to the App Store and 1 million people get it and start trying it out in the first 5 days, that's crazy. To me, at the time, I didn't really realize how crazy that was, because I was just getting into software development or like just getting into digital products at all. And I was like, yes, I mean, people build products and then people use the products, right? But that's not how that works. You have to build really great products and then you have to do a lot of work to get them to the people. So that was really impressive. And a lot of great things came from QuizUp. People joined the game, met other people playing sort of topics that were really specific to their interests. And some people even ended up getting married after meeting through QuizUp. And so that's like, there was a lot of fantastic things happening there. But also, a lot of people downloaded the app and sort of maybe started playing one game and then churned away and never played the game again. And what is the difference between those people? That was sort of like one of my roles as the founding analyst, to try to answer that question. I was hired by the CFO. And so he was tasked with reporting to the board of directors. What's going on with the game? How is it going? This was in 2013. This was at the time when the Silicon Valley mindset was like, just get the users and figure out revenue and monetization later. This has, of course, changed a little bit since then, but it was sort of just after the explosion of like Facebook and Instagram and all that stuff. And so everything that we did was around sort of understanding usage and user behavior and user experience so that we could get and build up our user base. We had a really impressive set of investors. We had Sequoia and Tencent. They were among our investors and on our board. And so we had people coming to us, the small team in Iceland, building a game that was really showing us like the front-running way of doing things. And I learned a lot from that, was very lucky. And that included all of this focus on like really understanding the user and the user experience. So I joined as an analyst, and one of the first things that the CEO said to me was like, "Steph, you're responsible for retention." And I'm like, okay, what does that mean? But okay, let's do it. Retention, how many of you are familiar with what retention means? Yeah, everyone knows what retention means. It's whether you return again to do something in the product that you're doing. It can be defined in various different ways, as you probably also know. There's like day 1 retention, there's day 30 retention, there's weekly retention, there's monthly retention. There's the definition of what brought you into the born cohort. There's the definition of what brought you in the return cohort, and all those things. So you can imagine back 10 years ago when I was doing this, how much confusion I went through, because there wasn't a lot to Google around retention at that point. When you Googled retention, you typically got like, it's the opposite of churn. And then when you Googled churn, it was like, well, for example, for a phone company, it's when someone switches from one phone company to another. And this is just so completely different from what you're trying to understand when people are interacting with your game. So these are sort of the questions that I was tasked with answering, but how did that go and how did that work? Well, this is, for example, one of the data mayhems that I sort of joined into when I was trying to figure out the retention to coming and playing a game again and again and again and again. And so, you know, when the CEO said to me, what does our retention look like? First, of course, I had to spend a lot of time on defining what retention was for us, and talking to all of the business stakeholders on actually defining that. And then I had to sort of start by joining all of these data sets that all of these different events lived in different SQL tables, and I had to make like these huge SQL join queries and make sure the attributes that are attached to these events that they actually are also matched together. So something that sounds like maybe a simple question is definitely not a simple question in this case. So my answer is like, well, you know, I'll take 6 weeks and get back to you on that retention question, you know? And that's just not really acceptable, is it? At least to the CEO, you know? The CEO just wants it now. And so that's the challenge, you know? It's a really difficult situation. And this prompted us at QuizUp to start trying to figure out how can we prevent this problem. Because it is really expensive to try to fix this problem after the fact. Because that's the situation that we were in, for example. You have to either take the time to sort of build some permanent pipelines where you patch and patch and patch and patch until you have like a unified view of what game started looks like. And then during the next product release, you get another problem again, and then you have to patch it again. But that's not the only problem with that. It's that when a product manager, a product owner, is trying to figure out how did this release go that I just released yesterday, they can't do it without going through an analyst. And that means they can't make a decision for weeks, maybe, until the analyst has time to actually go and fix the data and sort of make sure they have the right data at hand. And so that's why it's so important to fix these problems and prevent them at the source. And that's one of the things that I'm going to be talking about today, and I'm going to go deeper into what actually goes into that first mile of creating the data, and why it's valuable to think about that as a cross-functional team sport, meaning developers, product people, and analysts or data professionals. Those roles should all be included in sort of your release process for analytics. Going back to like a specific also example of how this sort of eventually pushed us over the limit of then starting Avo to fix this problem more permanently. A couple of us from QuizUp, we started another company after Avo. It was an idea that was based on QuizUp, and we sort of ran forward with that. And then we were onboarding one of our customers, and we were it was a B2B2C. It was a gamified micro-learning for employees. So we were onboarding, I don't remember exactly which customer it was. I think it was WOW Air. And all of their employees were supposed to download our app and start training themselves, preparing themselves to become like better stewardess and stuff like that. And we noticed that the sign-up method that they were choosing to the app were like only 2% were using the phone number sign-up method. You know what I mean? You can choose how you log in and authenticate to apps. And we were like, okay, why don't we simplify the onboarding process and just like speed it up and make sure people are just really quick and completing it. Let's simplify it and remove the phone number authentication method. And then our sign-up conversion plummeted from 81% to 46%. And we were like, what? What happened? How did that happen? We released a version where we had removed this phone number method. And all of a sudden, the rollout to WOW Air was really terrible and unimpressive to the WOW Air leadership team, because all of a sudden the majority of the people, the employees that were supposed to use this for training, they didn't even complete the sign-up. Okay, so what happened? We thought that the data looked like this, but in reality it looked like this. Let that sink in. There's a phone number with no B in our data set. And so this is so seemingly minor, right? I mean, everyone is laughing at this. How can one missing B in number cause you to make such a ridiculous decision? But that is happening all day, every day for companies all around the world. It's a tiny typo. It happens when a developer is like running quickly at implementing like, okay, when they use the phone number method, I'll send this analytics event called account created, and I'll add the sign up method, and it's gonna have a phone number property. It's so easy to make this kind of a mistake. And I'm sure everyone here can relate to that. But so the scale of impact can be that companies do something very terrible like this. And I mean, to put this in context, we spent then, a few weeks on discovering this opportunity. Then we spent maybe a couple of weeks on actually updating the onboarding screen and then releasing it. And then a couple of weeks on gathering this data and gradually seeing like, this is looking weird, isn't it? And then, you have to take a few weeks to roll this back and fix it. And that's a lot of time for a 3-4-month-old company, and this takes so much more time for larger scale companies. And so the decision that we were faced with there was like, well, are we then going to build the solution again that we built internally at QuizUp to fix this problem? Which we did. Internally at QuizUp, we built solutions, both processes and also tools, to make sure that we weren't making these kinds of mistakes. But I was like, we can't make and spend our time on like building the shovel before we can just start digging the hole, It doesn't make any sense. There must be a solution that we can buy, but we couldn't, which was crazy. And so that's sort of what pushed us over the edge of actually starting to build Avo so that this would happen less. And data scientists around the world would be less miserable around the world. So going into what is the first mile of data? So how does this problem happen? This problem happens because this is sort of the release cycle of product data. That's what that looks like. Not simple to grasp, I know, because it's not simple. So it starts with a product change. Product managers do something in Figma and a Google Doc or something like that, and they design a spec of a new release that they're about to pull their team into working on. Okay, and then they decide, let's measure the success of that. And this is for front-running companies that actually do like this process very effectively and do think about analytics up front, but that's not even everyone. And then sort of they pull in maybe an analyst and they work on defining, okay, let's see what impact this release has on our day one retention based on whether people see this chat message send button or not, or something like that. And they define those metrics, and then they have to define the literal event structures behind the metrics, and they do that in a spreadsheet or an Airtable. Some advanced companies have JSON files or YAML files on GitHub and do that. But most companies typically just do this on Slack. And they're like, hey, developer, can you implement the analytics for this? And they're like, sure. And then you end up with like all of the game started events that you saw. Because the developer doesn't have the entire context of what has already been implemented for exactly this user action for the wider product. Okay, but then we go into sort of getting feedback and requesting implementation. What happens there is like there's a conversation about like the analyst is like, hey, developer, can we implement this analytics event there? And can we add this property to it? And they're like, yeah, that looks great to me as an iOS developer. And then 2 weeks later, the Android developer is like, no, wait, that doesn't work for me. But at that point, the iOS developer is like, well, I have already implemented it that way. And it's already like on staging and we're about to release it. And you as a data scientist is like, okay, so do we allow iOS to release this app this way and then cause like conflicting events in the iOS app to the Android app? Or do we delay the release of the iOS app and ask them to pull it back and fix this? Or do we ask Android to go like a really extra mile to actually be able to implement the analytics events in the way that we originally designed them? In any case, we as the analysts are like, oh, I'm begging you. Oh, I know you hate me, but it's just like we're not making friends in this situation, and people are just not happy with this, and it's not an efficient process. And I haven't even covered sort of like what goes into implementing, the tracking calls in code. When you start doing that, then you sort of end up adding all of these analytics events all over the place, and you don't know what everyone else has added. So you end up with like song added, playlist, song added, add song to playlist, all of these different events. Then you go into the verification step, which the analyst or the tester has to take on and sort of confirm that the analytics event that you implemented actually matches the spec that you had up there in step 1. And then you use your human eyes to do that verification. And what do we as developers think about that? It's like, we know that we make so many mistakes all the time. So why are we doing this with our human eyes? I don't know. And so we have the Google Sheet maybe, and then we enter our databases and we sort of start looking at like, okay, does this event match the spec? No, it doesn't. And then you go back as an analyst and you're like, oh, please, I'm sorry. I know you're finished working on this feature. And you haven't been thinking about it for 4 days, but I just uncovered this bug in your implementation, and I would really appreciate it if you would fix it before we push this to production. And they're like, oh my God. And then you do that a couple of times. And so this is just so inefficient and terrible and really frustrating. And in my opinion, this is that way because there is not sufficient collaboration, cross-functional collaboration early in the process, and there isn't sufficient tooling to support that cross-functional collaboration early in the process. Look at all of the tools that we're using for the communication, look at the timings of when we're pulling in different people. It isn't designed for setting us up for success, people. And this then just continues in cycles. And typically we catch a lot of errors here, and then we go in analyzing our data in production, and then we also catch some more errors there that actually ended up going into production. So it's quite frustrating. I want to talk a little bit about then where should people start in fixing this problem. The first step, in my opinion, is sort of identifying where you are on these quadrants. Sort of in the early stage that I just described, the slide with the game started events, then we basically had sort of bad quality data shipped slowly. Maybe we went into bad quality shipped fast, because a lot of people were just working on analytics events and they just shipped them to production, and we sort of had like a Wild West, and we ended up with all of the different event versions that we had. And here we weren't, we're not slowing down the product teams when they're releasing. They are just allowed to run forward really quickly and add the analytics event as the last thing that they do before they ship to production. That's how that works, right? Okay, and then in that sort of, when I visualize that typical analytics workflow, that's when teams have realized how impactful it is when you ship bad quality data. And then you start adding all of these sort of ways and processes of trying to prevent that. And that's when you've ended up sort of in that sort of, okay, hopefully good quality, at least to some extent, depending on how rigorously you take that analytics process, the release process, but you ship it really slowly and everyone hates it. And this is the state where, in my experience, developers see analytics as a chore that they have to do for an analyst somewhere. That has nothing to do with the end user. Why would I be working on analytics at this point? In my experience, in that state, then the analysts also sort of don't trust the developers. They're like, developers, they can't do anything about analytics events. It's like it's this culture gap kind of thing. And I think the start of fixing this problem is not only tooling, but also this realization for analysts to realize that typically developers are a really smart group of people, and for developers to sort of get converted to seeing that analytics is one of the most powerful tools that we have to build better user experiences. It's not a chore that we do for analysts. It's actually our most powerful tool to build better user experiences. And I think the way to sort of convert our culture into that is sort of a collaborative process more earlier on. And I'll go a little bit into that later. But I want to just sort of quickly touch on tooling. And here I'm showcasing, I'm referencing Avo in a few of these slides, or in these cases, but that's not the point, because you can also solve this in other ways and build things internally. And we all love to build things internally. But so basically, we want a single source of truth for our tracking plan. So the first step is making sure we're not all working in like maybe a Slack and a spreadsheet, and making sure that if we have it in a spreadsheet, that we have some safeguards in place so that the spreadsheet is actually up to date. So that when we go into the verification step, then we have the right specs in place to actually be able to confirm that the analytics events match the specs. This will also allow us to use those specs both to generate code so that developers don't have to really think about whether they're forgetting a property or whether they have the right spelling of the analytics event. They just call one function and then they have the right event. And then they just have to provide the attribute values, and it also allows us to create some automated validations if we make sure that our sort of source of truth is accurate. And then we have to make sure that we design sort of the communication process there in the plan analytics update. We want that to include the cross-functional stakeholders that I just talked about. So I want to just go directly into that. And you can learn more about Avo there and get inspiration for the tool that you want to build internally or decide to use Avo. Making analytics a cross-functional team sport. I think the key thing here to that I want to highlight, the most important thing from my perspective, is starting to think about your data as a product. And I know we have other talks on the conference that is specifically talking, for example, about data mesh, and your data as a product is one of the principles of data mesh. I could not agree with that more. And so I want to encourage you, if you are in the data space and you're sort of working on getting started in sort of thinking about data as a product, I think you should treat it so much as a product that you should consider yourself to be a product manager and read product management books, like Inspired by Marty Kagan. I think that's the level of depth that you should think about your data as a product. And what that means is you have stakeholders. You have the people that are building your product, the developers that are actually implementing the analytics events. And then you have business stakeholders that are using your product, and you have yourself also, and you have product managers that need to use your product. And good product managers, they include these stakeholders very early on in the process for every single release. And so that's how we should be thinking about this for every single product release. Every single product release. And there's a scale of how this works today. It's the worst scale is like the CEO comes to me, Steph, and is like, "Hey, Steph, how did the release go last week?" And I'm like, "What release? What did we just release? What are you talking about?" And that's just because there's a product team that just run forward and I don't even know about it. And they just released the product and they didn't even add analytics to the release. So there is nothing that I can work with to actually look at whether and how that worked. And then we have the next stage, which is like the product team is like running forward and they're about to ship. And then they're like, "Steph, we need to add analytics and we're shipping in 5 minutes." And you're like, "Okay, let's design the analytics events, synchronize iOS and Android and web and backend, and ship it and test it and do that all in 5 minutes, and it's gonna go fine." And we're not gonna have any data bugs. And this is like this is the layer of thinking about data after the fact that you can end up in. And I really, really, really couldn't state more. I recommend doing this in the beginning of the product development process, before any developer starts writing code for the product release. And that's always how I recommend it, because it sort of allows you to think about why you're shipping your product while you're building it. So if you take a moment to step back and think a little bit, this is how I recommend doing it. There are loads of formats that you can do. We call it the purpose meeting. We generated this or developed this at QuizUp. It's basically a sit down with these stakeholders where we go through what are our goals, what does success look like. Elevated day one retention for people that saw the chat prompt on the end screen. Metrics, the goals. The goals are sort of more high level. The goals are like, we want people to, we want to increase people's engagement following gameplay. So we are going to add the ability to chat with someone one-on-one right after they finish a game. That's a goal. Metric, then you define like literally how are you going to see this on a chart? Because I think that is a really healthy way before you start designing analytics events. You want to think about how am I going to use them? How am I going to visualize them somewhere on a chart? I think that's really valuable, and it really prompts people to design better data in general. And this is the opposite of track everything, which I always recommend people do not do. It's a fallacy. You can't do it right. You end up with an unprioritized list of random events that you track in your product that are not going to answer your main business questions. And the other fallacy is sort of like, well, we have this feature, let's just add a bunch of events that represents the user behavior. The most important thing is that you first think about like, how are you going to actually visualize this or use this data? And then you design the analytics events. And for us at QuizUp, this began as like, the entire stakeholder team was there through the sit-down, through the entire design process, even the analytics events design. So we had an iOS developer, an Android developer, a backend developer, a designer, an analyst sit down and go through all of these together. And a product person. We didn't have product managers at QuizUp. Maybe that's different for a lot of people here. But the product role in general, like that, there was a designer in our case. So in the end, when we think about this up front, we went from the culture of developers seeing analytics as a chore that they did for analysts to actually seeing it as like this fundamental tool that they were able to use to build better products. And in the end, So we used to have like maybe a single developer, stray developer that would sort of look at mixed panel charts here and there, to like maybe 50 to 70% of the developers were really proactive in actually looking at how the product releases went. And in the end also, this sort of alignment on goals and metrics was a quick discussion. And then the developers went on and sort of designed the analytics events and suggested them in our tools for our review. And it went by really quickly and efficiently because we'd already had a conversation around sort of the purpose of the analytics events. So that is how I think about this. I really recommend sort of to summarize this. Think about the tooling that you have for this analytics release process and really bring together your stakeholders early on in the product. Could not recommend these things more. So with that, going into, I guess I'll start with this. Thank you. Do we have time for questions? How does that work? Yeah, perfect. Do we have any questions? Yeah, Hugo.
Thank you for really you mentioned this about the fallacy of tracking everything. I can relate. And also, it makes me think of the scenario where if I were to come in contact with a client and they say, look at all this data that we have. Help us with this. Can find something interesting with this. How would you approach such a situation?
That's a great question. So the question, to repeat the question for the audience, first a call out, I relate to the tracking everything fallacy. And then, but if a customer or a client or a company, I guess, is in the situation that they have tracked everything and they want you to find insights from it. Well, I would start by beginning with a very similar process and sort of figuring out what are the key questions that we're trying to answer. Like, and here it sort of depends a little bit on the scale that we're at. But when people have a lot of messy data, I always advise them against trying to fix all of their data at once. So that's one thing to maybe start calling out here. If you have a lot of messy data, you shouldn't at least start to try to fix it all at once. But you can start to try to realize what are the key business questions that you need to ask. And this talk was very focused on product analytics. And the reason for that is just the shift that's going on in the world right now in the last, decade or two, is that for businesses, product experience is sort of what makes or breaks whether you're going to be a successful business. Every company is going into creating a digital product, and if you're creating a digital product, you'll have to create a great user experience. And if you are planning on creating a great user experience, you'll really need to have quality product analytics. So I would always start by sifting sort of what are the questions that are top of mind for them, and I'd probably talk with different stakeholders, business stakeholders. It always depends a little bit on like what the use case is, and then start digging. That's the first step, and hopefully we have some gems there. What do you think?
I usually want to, my reasoning is let's start from the beginning, and then we can see if we can look at the old data later on. But generally looking at the old stuff is seldom a recipe for success.
Yeah, I relate to that. So Huka's calling out that he generally recommends starting fresh instead of trying to use the old business data. So maybe I didn't grasp the scale of how terrible the old data was when you were calling out this. And it sort of, this is exactly what we did at QuizUp eventually. We've had this really messy set of data, and we decided in the end that we are going to start fresh here. And we switched like all of our projects, they went into a completely different environment. Like we set up a new mixed panel project, a new Redshift instance, a new everything, where we had like really rigorous governance on what the event structures looked like for the event structures to be able to be allowed in the process. But the problem is like not everyone is in the situation of being able to just take time to do that. And then I really recommend that people start focusing on like maybe a single question that they have to answer. If you're an analyst and this is the situation that you're in, a lot of messy analytics event data, and you're sort of trying to get to a better place, I recommend starting with this process with a really small team. Like start finding a data curious developer or a data curious product manager, and like people that are actually, they relate to how terrible this process is, and just start with like a small feature. Do not try to start to fix the data for like your North Star metric, because that will require you to measure everything correctly in the product. So it's not going to be, that's going to be like a many months project before you can get like a single case study ready and release it to and sort of share it with the rest of the team. Instead, just start with the next feature release, answer like a simple business question, and showcase to the rest of the team that this can be better, more efficiently. Thomas.
Thank you, Steph, for the presentation. I think we made a lot more people data curious.
Oh, I love that question. The question is, how do you make a decision of what are you going to explicitly track as analytics data versus using the production data that's in place? So I think this is a hot topic. There are a lot of companies that are in the position of like the analysts depend on the production data to be able to answer any questions. There isn't any analytics event specifically implemented just for understanding analytics. This is a really difficult position to be in for two reasons. One, the analytics person and the data team is entirely dependent on being able to get these insights from infrastructure-related data. And so, depending on the organization, this will then cause the second problem, which is the infrastructure data starts depending on what your analytics needs are. And that's a really frustrating situation to be in for an engineer. If you're a server, this happened to us at QuizUp. We were relying on production data about games. Like we had like a production table called game, and it had all of the information and the metadata about every single game that had been played in the history of QuizUp, and we were able to sort of merge that data with a bunch of other data and figure out the next steps and sort of do some analyses. And then the infrastructure team wanted to refactor how they did that. And then they couldn't because our revenue analyses and like retention analyses, they depended on this being there. And so all of a sudden, as a server engineer, you're not just advocating for a better infrastructure for your product, you're actually advocating for like, okay, can't we do the analysis somehow else? Or like what, can the analytics team not use the new infrastructure? Can the, but it's like it's a huge decision all of a sudden. So I, in general, recommend decoupling this as much as possible, always. And I had a conversation yesterday with a person here on the conference that was talking about like they were a software engineer and they would just allow the analyst to subscribe to their Kafka stream and Kafka queue, and that's like really valuable as maybe a first step, but it is not the way that you should scale your analytics and think about that. Of course, you have to use things like maybe you were referring to, for example, like your Stripe subscription event or something like that, and I think the ability to use that is great. And at Avo, of course, we use that, for example, for our customers, and that's important. And the good thing about that is Stripe is maybe not necessarily about to change their infrastructure a lot or their front-facing events. So if you look at the event structures that Stripe had 3 years ago and that they have today, that you can subscribe to, they're probably going to look very similar. And that's why product data is so different from the general data that you can use. Is like your product data evolves so continuously. So yeah, my general recommendation, try to decouple it as much as possible and create your own as much as possible to reduce dependency there. And then your sort of other part of the question is like that type of data is maybe not as reliable, right? Because infrastructure data is like, this needs to be right or we die, there's the infrastructure engineers sit in the hot seat, while analysts can be more reactive and people are sort of like able to fix things a little bit after the fact, even though that's exactly what I recommend not doing. But so, because this is the situation, we sometimes get sort of unreliable analytics data. But again, I really recommend thinking about that as a cross-functional thing at the source. And then, at least if we have sort of missing data from analytics, hopefully it'll be sort of consistent across all of the analytics data that we have. So we'll be able to at least monitor trends within it. How are we on time? Is it? It's finished. All right. Thank you so much.